Excited to be moderating the best panel of the conference. So this essentially this panel on climate change will be looking at exploring challenges around aligning development goals with our larger climate change goals around adaptation and mitigation, as well as kind of thinking through the larger challenges about generating the resources and finances to support our development agenda. To do that, we've got two speakers. We've got Dr. Ghazala Mansuri, who's the lead economist at the World Bank and is also the global lead for the welfare implications of climate change. And then joining us online is William Mako, who spent about 2 decades at the World Bank and is now a distinguished professor at Sciences Po. So our presenters are going to have about 20-25 minutes each to present their work. Then we'll have an tete-a-tete amongst each other, and then open up the space to questions. Dr. Mansuri, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thanks everyone. Speaking for the second time, so there might be a tad of repetition. Bear with it. I'll try to skip over those parts. So I'm essentially going to be presenting work that we've just completed, which is Pakistan's Country Climate and Development Report. These are reports we're actually doing for all countries that the World Bank is active in, right? And they'll happen over time in different countries. We did a few last year. And I did the one for Pakistan with a team with me from various areas of specialties, right? So we had an energy team, we had an urban team, and so forth contributing to this. What I want to talk about today, essentially to you, and I'll give you my punchline so that if anyone really feels like they've had it, they can hear the punchline first instead of last, which is that Pakistan faces these multiple challenges. We've talked about them, right? They are severe macro instability, a lot of development challenges. We're an outlier. I'll go over some of that stuff, but we know that stuff, especially an audience like this, right? We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. So I'm going to start by telling you what the climate risks are, the scale of the climate risks facing the country. To tell you a little bit about the other risks we talked about a little bit yesterday, which is the environmental risks the country is facing, which really have nothing to do with climate change, right? But which interact with both climate change and with development very critically. And then we'll talk about, okay, so what do we need to do? How urgent is it? And is there indeed some kind of a trade-off, right, between what we need to do to address these emerging climate and environmental risks and the sort of development agenda, the unfinished development agenda that Pakistan has. And then we'll talk a little bit about the financing side of this and what can be done. The upshot of this report and of my presentation today is to just highlight the fact that almost everything Pakistan has to do for climate resilience and environment and reducing environmental risks is actually what it has to do for development that makes any sense at all, right? Which is that development has to be equitable and sustainable, right? It can't be something that's easily reversed. It has to be something you can rely on. The fundamentals of development are all served at the same time as building climate resilience and environmental resilience. So there are trade-offs. This is not to argue that there are no trade-offs anywhere. There are going to be some trade-offs. We'll talk about them. But really, we can get very, very far without having to worry about any trade-offs, right? And Pakistan doesn't need to do much on mitigation at all. If it does anything on mitigation in the next decade or two, that stuff has to be because it's needed for development, right? That is the punchline, right? Now I'm just going to go through and tell you what brings us to that. So, we don't have to spend too much time on this, but we just went through a fairly exceptional summer. Well, we went through an exceptional spring, which got basically overtaken by an exceptional summer, right? So we had a very exceptional heat wave, very early in the year, in spring. And that heat wave alone was a very disturbing event. It caused a lot of damage, caused forest fires, including for some of our fruit orchards and so forth. It caused crop loss. It caused a lot of we haven't fully examined some of the health and productivity losses that occur with that kind of heat. But the wet bulb globe temperatures were such in Pakistan and at various points that they were extremely close to the point at which the human body starts to cook from inside if you're outside. Right? We reached those temperatures, and those temperatures were sustained for days. Right? That is pretty alarming. And for that sort of a heat event to be followed by the sort of flood we had, and this flood was very peculiar in some ways. The monsoon changed its direction. We've been hearing about the fact that monsoons will become uncertain, that they'll become volatile, chaotic, but then they can also change direction, and this one did. It came from a completely different direction than we were expecting, right? Caused a lot of the damage in southern Sindh and southern Punjab, and then the water coming down in Sindh. Also caused a glacial lake outburst, something we've seen before. Some of these elements were there in 2010. So when I was looking at the numbers for 2010, the numbers actually are astoundingly similar in terms of losses. Heads of cattle lost, houses destroyed, people displaced, people who died, right? Those numbers are not very different from 20. We've had an event 12 years ago that didn't look, it's dissimilar in some respects. This was a little bit more intense. But we have signs. So every 12 years, let's say, I'm not saying this should happen again, but the signs and indications are it'll happen again, right? Unless we do something. We are poised for it. So let's look at what Pakistan's climate risk is first. So we know Pakistan is among the top 10 countries affected by climate change, which means that we're going to see warming in our part of the world, all of South Asia, not just Pakistan, is really sort of in the bullseye, sort of, right? Because we are literally going to see warming much higher than the global average. And this is also true under potentially less alarming climate scenarios. So these three that I'm showing you, this blue line is basically if the world acts now and acts well and acts in an orderly way, and we stay at roughly 1.5 degrees centigrade, there's still warming, right? And some of the upper limits on warming are above 2 degrees centigrade. We are roughly at 1 degree centigrade at this point, and we can already see what's happening. These 1 degree centigrades can make the difference between a lot of things, particularly for human health, productivity, and crops. The middle path is that we kind of, stumble along. We don't do very much. We pretty much go on business as usual, little bit of action, not particularly orderly. And then the red line going up is what we call the pessimistic scenario, right? Which is disorderly transition, delayed transition, where we don't really start reducing emissions significantly till after 2050, right? Maybe reach net zero around 2075 or 2080, then that's the trajectory we're looking at. And for Pakistan, those temperature differences are really alarming. Yeah, you can get 4-degree temperature change, basically, right? Higher than today. That's already, for a region that experiences some of the hottest temperatures anywhere in the world already, right? We have districts that have recorded the world's hottest areas. For people who do outdoor work and stuff, I'll show you that can be pretty alarming, yeah? Okay, so we also look at days of extreme heat, and those are also going to rise. There's days when you have exceptionally hot climate. We did some climate downscaling. And what we see here is, to just show you very simply what this is showing you. This is showing you the historical mean, taking 1990 to 2010. And you see that Sindh gets 103 days of temperature, which is above 30 degrees, yeah? And similarly, Punjab gets 94. Up here, this is the northern part of Islamabad, let's say 38 is what's the number of days of these kinds of temperatures in KP, and 37 in Balochistan. And as you go through, these are the 3 climate scenarios. Everything warms up. But what's really interesting is that the greatest warming actually takes place in KP. So our coolest area is going to get a lot warmer, right? So the warming trend will continue, and this is sort of a reasonable. By the way, this is only up to 2060. I just want to make sure. So if I go back, and I just want to show you one thing which you should keep in mind. These 3 lines don't really start to diverge till 2050. So everything I'm going to show you up to 2050 in the modeling and stuff is really, there's really no difference, or there's no big difference between the worst and the okay and muddle along and the take good action. It's after 2050 that these trajectories really fall apart. So everything I'm showing you is a conservative estimate because we don't really model anything after 2050 or 2060. Okay, so what do we expect to get? Certainly heat waves, right? More severe, frequent, longer. Water availability becomes unreliable, though it gets on average more. We're going to have more precipitation. There was some degree of disagreement on this in CMIP5 in the previous sort of modeling exercise, but under CMIP6, which is the last IPCC report, there's much more agreement and a much higher correlation between warming and more precipitation in this area. So we're definitely going to get more water. The problem is we're going to get it in ways that are going to be very disturbing. So, you'll have less snow and more rain in the mountains, which means that the timing of when water comes into our dams and then flows downwards and then is available for agriculture, the timing of Rabi and Kharif seasons, our cropping cycles, all of that becomes questionable and will have to change. We'll have glacier melt, which we know about, and that's going to change the flows in the system. We get into a flood-drought cycle, and this is really important. It's not all more precipitation. You're going to have cycles, droughts followed by floods, droughts followed by floods. So you really need to be both drought-resistant and flood-resistant to stabilize the system. And of course, there are implications then for water availability at different times. There will be also more evaporation because of heat, even though there will be more water falling. There's much higher risk for food and water insecurity. We know why, because agricultural productivity is really the thing that's going to be most affected. And the second thing most affected is going to be just human productivity, because the ability to endure heat and be productive. Right? Because particularly people who will have to work outside, construction workers, agricultural workers, anyone who spends any time outside. Then there is, obviously, then there are some of the really disturbing potential elements which are risks of major societal disruptions. There are very good global papers that came out last year showing this at a global scale, right? That essentially the South, which is us basically, are going to be really the most trouble. And then countries in the North are likely to do on average much better. There's incredible injustice in that, as you can see, because the South did not contribute to these emissions. But we are going to be the most affected. And then there will be a lot of displacement of migrants, but there'll also be micro displacements, which is displacements within the country, rural to urban and so forth, as agriculture starts to collapse, if we allow it to collapse. And if all of that happens, then you have, whatever we can do today to get this human capital issue, the basic development stuff done, right? So that we are in better position to take whatever's coming and deal with it now. Otherwise, it just gets a lot harder to do, right? So everything gets harder to do as you get into more of an erratic, more of a disturbed cycle, right? So this is just to tell you that even though climate risk is bad everywhere, if you downscale, you can see that depending on the indicator you're looking at, there's going to be a lot of variation across space. This is just looking at districts in Pakistan. And so we just look at heat wave, affected population, and poverty, right? So poverty on this dimension, heat wave. So anything in dark blue, these are areas that are at the high risk of both, right? It's very high density of population in the district that is heat affected, and that we do by looking at how many people work outside and plus the total population and things like that. And so you think of something like Tharparkar or Jafrabad or Haran, these are areas where these two things come together, right? Which means they're least prepared, most affected, right? If you then look at population working outdoors and heat wave affected, then you sort of see a few more districts becoming dark blue in the north as well, right? So, and we've done this for many indicators, right? We've looked at outside work and other things. I'm just showing you two. So you get a kind of a spatial sense when you're doing resilience investments, right? What's happening. Sorry, I did that wrong, I think. Did I want to go this way or? Okay. No, I wanted to, something is weird about this slide. Okay. Yeah, no, let me do this first and then I'll come to that. So then let's take, okay, so that's climate risk. Let's move on to environmental risk, right? Environmental risk is what we have done, right? Throughout, the globe has done the emissions bit, so we've done it all. It's all anthropogenic. But we locally did this, right? Which had nothing to do with anybody changing the climate. right? And this is basically a situation in which we have very, very high levels of environmental pollution. It's among the most polluted countries globally, right? Surface pollution, ground pollution, water pollution. We have very severely diminished soil fertility. And as soil fertility goes down, very critically, the soil's capacity to retain water, as we discussed yesterday, goes down. This is really important, right? Soil is meant to hold water, right? Even in the desert, soil holds water. Even sand holds water, right? But water, there's a certain amount of, the soil is capable of holding a lot of water, which means that as water falls from the sky, if you have good soil, it'll hold it, right? If you have too little water, it'll release it, so that you don't have a bad drought, right? And you don't have bad crop productivity. So soil is meant to hold water. It can't when it depletes, when there's less organic matter. And as I told you yesterday, I sent these plots out, and frankly, I was really shocked that they said that they were low to very low. I did not expect this for Punjab. I'm really still looking into the data, but it's a bit worrying. As we said, our water is pretty contaminated, and why has that happened? Well, agriculture is largely responsible for it. The way we run crop agriculture, right? That's caused a lot of the damage, right? And the way we run animals. So our cropping practices, constantly tilling soil, leaving soil bare, flood irrigation. When you do flood irrigation, which is the way we use our water, right? You basically kill all microbiota, mycelium, everything dies. Nothing can survive in flood water. The soil doesn't want flooding. It can't, it'll, if it's a good soil, if it's high carbon, the rain comes suddenly, it'll absorb it and everything. But if you constantly keep flooded land for weeks and months at a time, then all of the microbial activity, all the life in the soil gets killed, right? And so that's very bad for your soil. And then, of course, we use fertilizers and pesticides with absolute impunity. We burn crop, we do this crop burning business. We're expanding crop area into really fragile lands. We're deforesting for that. We graze our livestock in an unmanaged way. By the way, it's not just we. Globally, this is going on. I'm just telling you the Pakistan story. This is the global story of conventional agriculture. And so, of course, there's a wide range of ecosystem services on which our life rests, really. And I think we should take that seriously. Like, without pollination, none of us are going to be around, right? So without the bacteria, we're not going to be around. So like we can take it very lightly. It's not a very sexy topic in many ways, but it is for people like me, but not for everyone. So then you have a problem, right? If you don't take this stuff seriously. Then we have urbanization. It's completely unplanned, encroaching into grasslands, encroaching into cropland, just flat urbanization without any vertical attention to what we should be doing. As unchecked pollution from industrial processes, as we've industrialized, we've done nothing about industrial effluent. Nothing about sanitation. All of that effluent is either going into our surface water or into our groundwater, or we are putting it out into sea and killing our fisheries, right? Complete lack of waste management, infrastructure, sanitation. So all of this environmental damage that we've done is already having a very significant drag on our agriculture and labor productivity. We talked about yields being down and stuff, and we can go over it briefly today, but it's reducing labor productivity because you have ill health, right? And you have air pollution, and people are just depleted. Both because of the air they're breathing, the water they're taking in, possibly the food and its low nutrient content, all of that. But there are health impacts that are fairly serious. And then, of course, there's the difficulty controlling floods. And someone has estimated, we've got estimates of that. People try to cost this stuff out to see what does this mean in terms of equivalent of GDP. So you can say it's about 10% of GDP, right now. And of course, there is further decline expected, and this thing is all going to interact with climate change. So I'm going to show you this one thing which I found very interesting. We did some work last year on the cities of Lahore and Karachi as part of this report. And what I'm showing you is basically Karachi and Lahore at the Union Council level, right? And in Lahore, we have this measure that, we don't have to talk about, actually that's not relevant for this, but anyway, we mapped these cities and we looked at average surface temperatures within city neighborhoods, right? And so you can see in Lahore, for example, that the dark red is about 43 to 46, this is summer temperatures, right? Summer daytime temperature. And you can see where the higher temperatures are in Lahore, right? They're right there in the built up area. Go down, that's the area which has absolutely no green cover, right? And the difference between the summer temperatures there and here is up to 6 degrees centigrade, right? 6 degrees centigrade. between being exposed and outside in the summertime in an area that has green cover and an area that doesn't. You can have up to a 6 degree centigrade difference. That's just enormous. The difference between health and in-health, and so forth. Karachi, of course, has very sparse vegetation to speak of, but yet you see that right at the coast, right here where the mangroves are, these are the lowest temperature areas, right, for Karachi. The rest of Karachi is very dry, not a lot of green cover, higher temperatures, higher summer temperatures, and less cover. So turns out that these areas that are very hot are also typically poorer areas. So within city variations tend to be very punitive to poor people who live in densely packed neighborhoods that have very little green cover. We see the same pattern with air pollution. We're starting to look at the data. As part of this report, we installed about 75 sensors with SERP last year across Lahore. And we are now starting to get that data and analyze it, and just to see within city variations in air pollution difference and what might be causing that and how important is it. Here we did an experiment with just some, oh dear, all right, with some AI and machine learning kind of stuff, where we said, all right, what if we increase green cover, right, in these neighborhoods? So we increase green cover by about 15 percentage points, and you can see what happens to day and nighttime temperature in Lahore, right? You can get, just with 15 percentage point increase in green cover across the board, not even targeted, it was just an experiment, you can get a 1 degree or more difference in day and nighttime temperatures, right, immediately. So that we thought was very interesting to see. All right, and then we did some modeling on climate risk. This is a selected number of risks. It's using a macro model and then connecting it to a micro simulation beneath it to get poverty impacts. And so you take a climate scenario, you run it through a macro model, and then you do micro simulation at the lower end. This is an optimistic scenario. This is a pessimistic scenario. And just with these selected climate risks, it's risk to agriculture, and a few of them, I can go over them later, you get a 9 percentage point decline in GDP by 2050. Selected risk. This is a real underestimate, but still you get a 9% decline. And then, of course, if you add to that the risk from air pollution, another 6.5%, add from them from water insecurity, you're already at 20% GDP loss by 2050, right? And that 9% alone, this 9%, not all of this, is enough to basically unwind poverty reduction. So if you see that what's happening here, basically rural poverty, this is what happens to poverty if you leave things alone, if you go by trend. Just muddle along, nothing bad happens, yeah? This is about what we could do. This is what it happens. It nearly flattens out. In urban areas, it almost completely flattens out. So you have no further decline in poverty. In rural areas also, you have a more or less flat line. So this much is enough to unwind poverty reduction up to 2050, relative to what we would expect, given Pakistan's trend, which has been a very rapid and decline in poverty, at least, yeah? Okay, I won't spend any time on emissions. Pakistan's emissions are not significant, right? They are rising, and they are high. So per unit GDP, we emit too much, which is inefficient use of fossil resources. And that we should fix, and we can fix. And this is the distribution. The only point I want to make here is about half of our emissions come from agriculture and land use. The other half come from energy, right? So just keep that in mind. Nothing else needs to be really discussed here. We can return to the economy, yeah? So in Pakistan, the good news, bad news, right? So the good news is that we've been very successful at reducing monetary poverty, right? In fact, we are the most successful country in South Asia in doing that, and you can see that line. And indeed, this is real. We've verified it, worked on it a lot. There are no questions about it anymore. We can talk about the sustainability and what's driving it and all of that and stuff, but this happened. But our growth just kind of flattened out, and we've fallen below the lower middle income country average and below the South Asia average by a very good bit, right? So we know all this. I'm not going to spend any time on it, but just say we have chronic fiscal stress, we have the circular debt, we have very low investment to GDP, low tax to GDP, huge subsidies that we are doling out in energy, agriculture, and irrigation that are largely inefficient, inequitable, and yet, I mean, it's very hard apparently to reverse them or remove them. We are an outlier in all aspects of human capital. We went over this stuff yesterday, so I won't spend too much time on it. But it's really shocking, right? I mean, we had double the under 5 mortality rate compared to everywhere else in South Asia other than Afghanistan. We look like Afghanistan, actually. Afghanistan and Pakistan look very similar on these numbers, right? They went through a 40-year war, right? And they look exactly like us on human capital, right? Which is just unbelievable, really. I mean, if you look at it, it's just like, what, right? Just look at these like numbers, right? 34% of girls in secondary school, everybody else is at above 60, right? Everybody else is about 90 for net enrollment in primary school. We're sitting at 68, right? Child stunting, everything. Fertility, we talked about that, 3.3. The whole region is at replacement, right? That's very costly for us, actually. We shouldn't underestimate the cost of this fertility business, right? That we've not been able to address. And of course, all of this means what? Very low labor mobility, very low educational mobility intergenerationally, and basically structural inequalities of opportunity that have just kind of become more and more entrenched in society over time, right? So I want to actually go from here to just kind of change. So we've talked about the economy, we've talked about the environment, climate, right? So I want to turn attention now to, okay, so what do we do, right? So let's go back to those two big sectors. Where is our chronic macro stress coming from? It's coming from energy, essentially, and the money, that constant fiscal stress, macro stress from low tax to GDP, from our energy bills that we can't pay, from our agriculture and irrigation subsidies that we are carrying, right? So let's look at energy and agriculture then, right? Just as two sectors and what's going on here. Right? So we get a lot of our energy from imported fossil fuels, right? And you know all of this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. It also causes enormous air pollution and health problems. So I think that's something we should focus on. That it's not just that we are spending a lot of money on this that we can't afford, but that we are also causing an enormous environmental impact, right? There's growing financial deficits, fiscal burden. We know this. You know these numbers, so I won't spend too much time on them. And therefore, and some of the stuff is just dumb. It's poor performance and inefficiencies that cause a lot of things like theft, line losses. We've done nothing about this stuff, right? Billing, things that we can address. And there was a very nice talk earlier today that we were in, this energy session, that just talked about a few things we could do right away. And then, of course, as a result, the quality of service delivery for energy supply is really poor, right? And that has productivity implications. When people can't be certain about where it'll come from, it has implications for grid defection and how people feel about, and then you don't want that grid defection to go too far, right? So I don't want to spend too much time. Let's talk about agriculture. I already talked to you about agriculture, so I want to use my time for getting to the results. But you know this already, so I won't spend more time on it. Agriculture is a mess. We can't go on with agriculture the way it is now, yeah? These subsidies cost us between 2.2 and 2.7 to 3 billion US dollars every year, right? Just in subsidies to Punjab and Sindh for agriculture and irrigation. So essentially what we are arguing for is, look, you have no choice but to do resilience spending. You have really no choice, you have to do it. And you have to do it to address your climate and environmental risks. At the same time, you have to do development. And development is likely to be unwound by these risks, right? So you have to keep that in mind. So we suggest these 5 sectors where we have to act now, and then we talk about whether there are any trade-offs, and I'll show you really that there aren't any, right? Certainly not in most of them. So I'm going to start with the, well, let me tell you this quickly. So we use this metric to gauge how we should assign policy priorities, right? So you want to do A. What's its impact on development? What's its impact on climate? How ready are we to do it, right? Are there some hurdles in the way? Financing, policy readiness, so forth. And so that's how we kind of rank policies in terms of when you should start them. And then we have a time urgency. Time urgency just means, are you ready to start it today? You're ready to start it 4 years from now? Ready to start it 8, 7, 10 years from now? And of course, it'll take what it'll take to actually get it done. So we don't mean start it now and finish it now, but start it right away, as in there's no reason to delay, right? This is sort of the framework we use. And within this framework for agriculture, for example, we have these 4 policies that I'm going to go through, right? The first is just remove and repurpose all existing subsidies, right? Those subsidies, and we show this in the report, basically do no good to anybody, right? It's not like, well, they do good for big business interests, like in sugarcane, or fertilizer producers, but they don't help farmers, they don't help people. So they're not equitable subsidies, right? And they're inefficient. So, and you know these subsidies, so essentially for electric tube belts, for example, we're doing more work on it now, but the first piece of work we did, we interviewed 10,000 farmers last year. Aziz is here, he helped with that. And basically we found that, essentially 2 things very interesting that need to be looked at more. Tube wells are definitely owned by richer farmers. No news here. Everybody knows this, right? So if you remove the electric subsidy, tube well subsidy, the question that was in our mind was, will that affect prices of tube well water? So a lot of farmers buy tube well water. It's not just the owners that are affected by the subsidy, but there's widespread purchase of water. In fact, it's extremely important in the Punjab. So the question for us was, how does this market work, right? We're not seeing any difference in prices across space. The prices are all seem to be set by diesel costs for tube well, and then everybody else takes that cost. So although electric tube wells are much cheaper to run because of the electricity subsidy, they still charge the prices for diesel, which are higher, right? And of course, solar, they don't pay anything, but they still charge the same price, roughly. So our sense is that we need to understand better the local market for this water, so we're doing some work on that, so that if you were to remove a subsidy, how would you protect water buyers, right, in this market, right? But overall, all of these subsidies are removable, right? Certainly wheat, certainly fertilizer, sugar for sure. Pakistan has the very dubious, whatever, of being the country with the most diabetes in the world now, right? I think India is very close to us. So we produce a lot of lovely sugarcane, and then we have a lot of sugar products, and now everybody has diabetes, right? So the health costs are really serious, guys. I mean, this is like one of the worst conditions in the world to get. And for 1/3 of the population has diabetes. They're not pre-diabetic, they have diabetes, right? So that's pretty alarming. And then, of course, we want people to take these subsidies, repurpose them, use the money to support sustainable, climate-smart, regenerative agriculture. This can be done. It's not technically very difficult. I know. I'll do 5 more minutes. Yeah? So I'll skip this support a sustained adoption because I already said that. And then you need to improve and modernize. We have a huge IBIS system, the Indus Basin Irrigation System, largest in the world, but it's in terrible disrepair, doesn't make its costs. We do all the numbers. We show you how much we spend on it. We don't recover even the maintenance costs of these systems annually, right? And we need them for flushing the system. We need water for environmental use. The system has to be up and functioning. We have to invest in it. We have to rationalize it. We have to charge for water, right? I mean, the one point on water is we have to charge people for water. This unregulated extraction of groundwater and surface water is just ridiculous, right? So we'll have to charge people for water. And fix the system and make it more reliable. And then livestock has to be handled the same way as crop agriculture, which is in a regenerative way. You have to regenerate rangelands, croplands. By the way, livestock on rangeland produces a ton less methane than livestock in confined animal feedlots of any type. So it also deals with the methane problem, and then you can use it for various ways. Maybe you want to use this for manure. It's very valuable. So we don't need to waste that. It's incredibly valuable for composting, for animal use. We can turn it into a biofuel, but you have to manage it safely. Okay, energy, and I won't spend, we need to transition from fossil fuels, and this is not for mitigation. I have zero interest in mitigation. We don't need to mitigate, right? We need to transition from fossil fuels because they're breaking our back financially. That's the reason we need to do it, right? And they will break our back even more as we go into the future. Pakistan has this indicative generation capacity expansion plan. We need to act on it. We look at scenarios in the modeling where we accelerate that with speeding up electrification. We talk about what would a carbon tax imply. We model that. I'll show that to you really quickly. Of course, we need to improve supply side efficiency. Let me show you the results here of just implementing the IGCEP, right? Properly, the current IGCEP. And these lines are basically telling you what the GDP impact would be. And so it has a moderately positive impact on GDP in the early period. That effect tends to taper off in the later period if you finance it domestically, which means that in the end, energy prices will have to go up a little bit to pay off that investment, right? But then you have a clean system, okay? This is the impact of that on pollution. It goes down, as you see. So air pollution declines very dramatically, and there's really we can't underestimate the impact of that given what we are dealing with right now. There were almost a 30% decline in air pollution from doing both IGCEP, which is the yellow line, and the blue line is more electrification, so shifts processes towards electricity, right? Along with implementing IGCEP. Working days lost go down by over almost 50%. right? So you really have a big effect because of this is coming from the air pollution effect, right? You reduce air pollution, working days lost go down, and of course it reduces emissions, right? Very significantly, which contributes to both of these. There's a small impact on poverty. It rises because in the end, as prices start to go up, when we are paying off these investments, if they're domestically financed and so forth, then you have to pay them off. You can deal with that because all of these ineffective subsidies in the system could be repurposed and removed from this kind of constant fiscal stress and money could be kept aside to target people who really need it, right? And of course, we have to address demand-side efficiency, and the transition has to be just. This is probably for Pakistan most important for coal, and we don't have a huge domestic coal sector, so we don't have a lot of people working in coal, but we need to take care of that, right? So I want to show you this, which is the result on the carbon tax. So we look at very moderate carbon taxes, starting with $1 in 2025 and basically going up to $20. That's the low carbon tax, right? By 2050, and a slightly higher carbon tax which starts at $2 and then goes up to it goes up to $40 by 2050, just rising gradually, right? In both carbon taxes, we do full revenue recycling, which means that hard to abate industries get their money back, and the bottom 50% of the population is fully protected. They get everything back, right? So essentially, when you take so the revenue recycling is very important, and you can see the effect of that of the carbon tax. Basically, a very small effect on poverty because obviously we are revenue recycling back and protecting the poor. So and then I show you we have these results when we combine these with IGSAP. So you do a carbon tax, but you also implement IGSAP, you also implement electrification. That moves us very far along, right, in terms of cleaning up the environment and getting rid of this fossil fuel dependence, because it's sort of a general incentive to use less, right? Just to use less fossil, so it increases energy efficiency and makes people active. So a carbon tax can have a very beneficial effect. I want to also just say that in a context like ours, where we don't tax, we are unable to tax small businesses, urban businesses. A carbon tax might actually be a good equalizing strategy. Everybody has to pay that tax. Then you protect the bottom, right? But you bring a lot of people so-called into the tax net, right, by putting a carbon tax. So I think I've become sympathetic to a carbon tax for that reason. I won't spend any time talking about this. These are more challenging. Industrial decarbonization, we have some hard to decarbonize sectors. This is where the trade-offs will be. They're very costly. So we postpone those. Fine, we do them, but we don't have to start them tomorrow, right? And then, of course, we have to decarbonize transport, but that doesn't have to happen today. I want to show you this, though, and you'll have to give me another few minutes to do that because I want to go over this. Yeah. So this is important, guys. So what we did is we ran a model through saying, okay, what if we invest in human capital, put all the money we need back and completely guarantee, and here I'm focusing just on child stunting. I'm not looking at education. We didn't have the numbers for it in time. We would have wanted to add that too. But we're just looking at what if we get the levels of stunting down dramatically to 5% by 2050, and we get the fertility rate down to replacement by 2035, right? We do all the investments to do that. This policy has, by and large, in our macro model and our poverty reduction, the biggest positive impact, right? So you look at the impacts on GDP. GDP goes up by 10%, over 10 percentage points by doing this by 2050. Because of the expansion in labor productivity, health, fewer children messed up with diarrhea and other things and growing up sick. GDP per capita goes up even more, obviously, because you're addressing fertility at the same time. GHG emissions, actually, this is very interesting. Let me hold off on that. And let's look at poverty. Poverty goes down dramatically, right? So this is a policy that is just a win-win. I mean, we have to do it. I mean, just running this through the macro model. It's a partial policy. We haven't even looked at the impact of education, which would itself be very beneficial. The emissions story is very interesting. As you bring people out of poverty, they're going to consume more energy. As they're going to consume more energy, your emissions will go up in the short run. So we also show here to you that if you invest in human capital while decarbonizing your energy sector, right? So this is all these lines. Sorry, I'm going over all this stuff very fast, but this is human capital with IGSEP plus electrification, with the carbon tax. Then you see that the emissions will not go up at all, right? So if you clean up your energy while you're doing your human capital, right? So you're improving your human capital outcomes. Yes, these people will come out of poverty. Yes, we want them to demand more energy. They need more energy, right, to improve their lives. But if that energy is cleaner, it's not a problem, right? So this is why I wanted to show you this. And then I'm going to move on from here just to the last bit, which is I'm going to skip this and just show you some financing, and we'll stop here. And there'll be a good segue, I think, for Bill to take over. We did some very rough numbers, guys. This is based on just things we could put together, just to get our thoughts together, right? It's like, what will all this cost, right? What does it mean? This is just projections for this decade out to 2030, that's all. It's about 323, 348, depending on, we tweak this graph a little bit. I'm showing you this one. Our final graph says 348. Those numbers, differences are not important, right? We need something like 330 billion over a decade, right? To do all of this. And this includes the agricultural transformation, this includes solid waste management, this includes all of this stuff, right? Transition out of coal, so buy back all the coal, all of that. Do the transport decarbonization, low carbon power supply, all of that. And then we looked at what resources do we have, what resources could we generate domestically, right? Not all of this money is going to come from the outside, right? That is not going to happen, right? So we need to generate resources domestically, and we need to fix our own systems. We know that now because nobody's going to lend to Pakistan without that. So we show, for example, if you look at this, the explicit subsidies to fossil fuels could free up 65 billion. The explicit subsidies in ag and water could free up another 26 billion. That's already like 80, 90 billion, right? If you put a carbon tax, you can get another, even with the revenue recycling, you can get about 14 billion left over, right? And then there's blue carbon credits, reorienting already existing public expenditures towards more sensible things, and the money that we get from bilateral, from IFIs of different types, like World Bank and so forth. So this leaves a residual financing gap of about 158, not of 300. So we could generate about half this money with sensible policies, right? And this doesn't include all the stuff we've talked about yesterday, increased income tax, increased property tax. It doesn't include any of that stuff, right? So we could generate a good bit of money, and if we did some of this or all of it, or even some of it, then the signaling value of that to global markets would be enormous. I mean, just 2 days ago, there was a blog by the head of the IMF that first talked about, and I was discussing this is the first time I saw them put it out, is that they've done some work, and now they think that nature for climate swaps, debt for climate swaps or debt for nature swaps are a thing, and they should happen. And Pakistan would obviously be a country with very extremely high risk, and they include adaptation there. So if we switch to these resilient systems, you create the carbon sinks, MRV systems, which are these monitoring verification systems for looking at carbon storage in soil. They are improving every day. We see massive increase in their accuracy, predictability down to the plot level. You could pay farmers for storing carbon, and you could get global finance for doing that if you wanted to through various nature-based solutions. So let me just end here. I think this is it. And there are some things that we could be doing immediately to increase access to global finance, which we're going to need. All right? Okay.
Thank you, Ghazala, for superbly summarizing some of these larger climate change impacts and potential policy interventions. And now we turn to this other question of really how do we finance these steps and these interventions. And for that, we turn to William Mako, who's joining us online. So can you hear us, Bill?
Quite well. Is this okay?
Yes.
Great.
Audience, can you guys hear him? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, take it away.
Okay. Okay, greetings to all of you from a basement in Rockville, Maryland. Happy to be with you this morning. Going to shift gears a bit. Ghazala's presentation was very, very comprehensive. Mine is going to be have a more narrow focus on climate finance. Some perspectives here. This presentation comes from a paper we did in earlier this year in May, which I co-authored with Ijaz Nabi, and we had valuable research assistance from Amna Mahmoud and Shahryar Khan. The focus of this paper is really on global climate finance trends, right? That's really the foundation for the paper. And then we applied these implications of these trends to our understanding of the 2021 nationally determined contributions that were prepared for COP26. So I just want to make clear that I am in no way, shape, or form an expert on Pakistan. It's really the foundation here is climate finance trends and trying to draw some implications from that for implementation of this earlier NDC paper. Now that was interesting. The NDC paper really did emphasize mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, not so much on adaptation to climate change. If I remember correctly, the NDC paper talked about 151 billion of investment in energy and only about $7 or $8 billion of investment in adaptation. So we are sharing that that perspective. Now, of course, since the paper was written, you all had those horrible floods in June in Pakistan with the damage that Ghazala summarized so well. The other thing that happened since the paper was written was this emphasis we saw at COP27 on the G7 countries accepting responsibility for climate damage and providing some sort of compensatory fund to assist damaged countries. Nonetheless, we're going to I'm going to focus the rest of the presentation on climate mitigation. These are just some highlights as we saw them from the government's 2021 NDC paper. The idea in it was to cut projected 2030 baseline emissions by 50%. There was an interesting calculation as to how that would be funded, of that 50% reductions from the projected baseline, 15% would be funded from domestic sources and perhaps with green bonds and support, and 35% would be supported from international financial sources. The investments outlined in the NDC by 2050 were mostly in the energy sector. These included $20 billion for hydropower, $93 billion for other renewable energy, both new renewable energy, and $13 billion to replace two coal plants, $20 billion to upgrade transmission, especially to accommodate variable renewable energy. There was listed $18 billion, which seems like a lot to me, to buy out two new coal plants and the Thar coal mines. There was also talk in the NDC about completing the 10 billion trees tsunami program and addressing crop burning. There was sort of an underlying tone throughout this paper that, in the government's view, that access to concessional climate finance will be key to implementing this program, which raises an interesting question. How much concessional climate finance can Pakistan realistically expect? A lot of these data come from the Climate Policy Initiative's annual report of last year. It summarized the activity in 2020. And the 2020 total for all climate finance was about $632 billion, which was considered to be just about 15% of what is really needed. And of this amount, of the $632 billion, just about 14%, or $89 billion, was concessional climate finance, either in the form of grants or substantially below market credit. Now, on this, I think Pakistan would in fact have some claim for below market below market concessional climate finance. The paper took a look at what we called middle tier emitters. So these were, we ranked countries by CO2 emissions in 2018. I think this group of middle tier emitters goes from the 7th ranked country, I think, which was South Korea, down to the 48th ranked country. And then we ranked those countries by 2020 GDP per capita. So Netherlands would be at the top of the middle tier emitters category, and Pakistan would be at the bottom of the middle tier emitters category in terms of GDP per capita. So some basis for a claim on concessional climate finance just from that. Nonetheless, given the scarcity of overall climate finance and within that the scarcity of concessional climate finance, I think it's reasonable to agree with Climate Policy Initiative's assessment that concessional climate finance is likely to remain scarce and to focus on, quote, more challenging sectors and geographies, right? So they highlight sub-Saharan Africa, they highlight agriculture, forestry, or other land use projects. I think it's also important to add a lot of the concessional climate finance seems likely to go to climate adaptation, right, which is likely to be a non-remunerative type of activity. Another big challenge for concessional finance, climate finance, in the area of financing investments in renewable energy is the fact that renewable energy has just become very, very cost competitive with fossil fuel costs. So you see here costs per kilowatt hour of electricity down there at the bottom in that grayish zone. You see the range of costs for fossil fueled electricity per kilowatt hour and the various, you then see how various renewable energy sources compare to fossil fueled electricity. And you see some pretty substantial improvements between 2010 and 2020, especially in the areas for solar power, either photovoltaic or concentrated solar power, as well as in offshore wind. Onshore wind was already considered to be fairly, very cost competitive. So that can be a big challenge, especially if you're trying to, I mean, the implication is that renewable energy projects can be run and should be run as real businesses, and given the fact that they can be run as real businesses, it's become increasingly difficult to argue that these should be the subject of concessional finance. Now, the implications of this for this potential $151 billion in energy investment that the 2021 NDC was talking about, $151 billion by the year 2050. In terms of concessional finance, maybe 25% of the total. Transmission, improvements in electricity transmission would be good candidates, good candidate for concessional. Much of the spending for coal plant decommissioning could be a good candidate for concessional finance. I have some questions about the $18 billion price tag in the 2021 NDC, but we'll get to that later. But otherwise, it seems to me that, or it seems to us that market-based climate finance, i.e. non-concessional, would be, there could be an expectation that about 75% of the 151 billion should be via market-based concessional finance, including 20 billion for hydropower and 93 billion for other renewable energy, including renewable energy to replace 2 coal plants. Now, this would occur mainly via PPPs, public-private partnerships. So it's worth considering what would facilitate market-based climate finance and financially viable public-private partnerships. We see 4 facilitators here. First would be full cost recovery for the renewable energy investors. I do not have a perspective on how that goes in Pakistan now. I've paid attention to these discussions about subsidy, but I don't know the implications for renewable energy investors at the moment. A conducive legal and regulatory framework for public-private partnerships. It is interesting in cross-country ratings, Pakistan does relatively well in terms of its PPP legal and regulatory framework. Macroeconomic stability is also important. There are plenty of people in the room over there who have a more considered and sophisticated view on macroeconomic stability in Pakistan than I do. And then a good reputation for rule of law, especially as this affects contract enforcement, property rights, and physical security. It is worth noting that Pakistan does score relatively low on rule of law in the World Bank governance indicator. It's about 30 on the 0 to 100 scale. On this question of, yes.
More, please, to finish.
I'm sorry. My predecessor had 45 minutes.
More
no, I need a little bit more than that. Please bear with me. Thank you. On decommissioning the 2 coal plants, I wanted to make some comparisons here with the 18 billion brooded in the 2021 NDC, which seems high. We didn't have access to the power purchase agreements or other contractual items for the 2 SAR 1 and 2 coal-fired plants. But with reasonable assumptions about returns on equity and market value relative to book value, we were estimating that maybe it would cost 3.3 billion to buy out the equity and debt investors. Decommissioning costs, environmental cleanup, for instance, based on U.S. experience, might add another 200 million. Just based on a recent World Bank South Africa decommissioning project, retraining and safety nets for plants and mine workers might add another 300 million. So, our estimate was much lower for just the 2 coal plants. I don't know about the mines, something in the area of 3.8 billion. In terms of coal plant decommissioning, it does seem like a great target for concessional climate finance. And there's been a lot of activity since COP26. You have this international partners group, the core members of which are UK, France, Germany, US, EU, some co-financing by World Bank and ADB. We've recently seen pledged or public financing of 3 projects, 8.5 billion in South Africa, 20 billion for Indonesia, and 7.75 billion for Vietnam. There's not a lot of detail on these deals that I've been able to find, or other people I've talked to have been able to find. It tends to be press release type material. But the typical terms have to do with cutting power sector greenhouse gas emissions in each of these countries to some sort of agreed tonnage of carbon dioxide by 2030, raising renewable energy output percentages to a specified level by 2030. The typical terms, it seems it's mostly market-based or low interest loans. The South African government was complaining that only 4% of its 8.5 billion is in the form of grants. Again, I find and it's not, the problem is I'm just not seeing what the details are on this. So the sequencing of donor disbursements versus government actions is, it's not at all clear. Also, there's just a lot of coal plants out in the world. The International Energy Agency estimates a current worldwide inventory of $1 trillion in coal plants. So $36 billion so far is a good start, but small relative to the total. So I think it's reasonable to expect that concessional climate finance will remain scarce, even for coal decommissioning. So I think this may have some implications for Pakistan. For instance, donors may want to look at maximizing greenhouse gas emission savings per megawatt decommissioned or per the cost of decommissioning. It might make sense to save concessional climate finance for non-remunerative uses, for instance, environmental cleanup, worker retraining, safety nets, community support, right? Donors may increasingly expect that replacement renewable energy is going to be financed via market-based resources. You know, if the three international partners group deals seem relatively vague, and in fact are vague, there might be opportunities for governments to compete, for instance, by specifying parts of projects that should be financed by concessional versus which can be financed via market instruments, and also a closer and clear sequencing of results delivered by governments versus donor disbursements. And I think maybe there's also going to be a potential, maybe more potential to supplement donor credits with income from the international sale of carbon credits. On this latter question, we've done and keep updating our calculations on whether the clean development mechanism, which seems to become relatively moribund after the Kyoto Protocol expired, whether that could be used to support coal plant decommissioning. So for instance, we estimate that it would cost about $2.5 billion to buy out the Thar Block 1 coal-fired plant equity and debt investors. We assume grants could be available for environmental cleanup, worker safety nets. We have a calculation that shutting down this plant would save about 5.7 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year for the next 22 years. For this, the government could get an equivalent amount of EU emission trading system carbon credits. Now, there's a possibility, for instance, and this is a bit of a thought experiment for you all, maybe the government could finance retirement of this particular coal plant with a, let us say, $2.5 billion loan from a consortium of development finance institutions at 5% for 22 years. If so, the annual debt service interest plus principal amortization would be about 190 million. Now, it should be possible for the government to service this debt annually by selling 5.7 million carbon credits, for instance, on the EU emission trading system. And this would work so long as the value exceeds 31.4 euros per ton. If you see over there on the right side is a summary of EU ETS activity. The trading volume in 2021 was pretty robust, 683 billion euros, which should be enough to accommodate annual sales for this deal of 190 million. The recent carbon credit price as of last Friday was 86.6 euros per ton. And the price has been above that 32 euro break even since late January 2021 and trending upwards. So, you know, there's some hope that it might be possible to use that mechanism either to totally decommission some plants or to supplement other donor funds for it. Two other quick items. One would be this 10 billion trees tsunami program. It looked to us like there 2 billion trees had been planted and there were 8 billion trees to go. We found as a model for this conservation in the specialized area of conservation finance, this Nature Conservancy deal with the government of Pakistan in November 2021. TNC issued a $364 million blue bond and then loaned the proceeds to the government of Belize, which had a B- rating, for 19 years at 61%, backed by a partial risk guarantee from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. So most of these proceeds were used by the government to buy back a $553 million 2034 government bond at 55% of face value. The government then committed to using some of the reduced requirement for debt service for purposes of marine reef protection. The paper talks about applying this.
Sorry, Bill, but we really do have to close it. So if you could, because we will come back to some of these
I'll
things
stop now.
in the Q&A. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I apologize for.
If you don't quite get it, I used 20 minutes of time.
Yeah.
My predecessor had 45 minutes, but be that as it may.
No, apologies, but only because we want to actually have a little bit of a discussion, and I'm hoping that you can come into that discussion and actually make some of the points, and we're also losing the audience, so I'm conscious of that, and I don't want us to be here by ourselves.
You need to leave promptly at 6 o'clock, so.
Should I take over, Sanval? What would you like?
Ceding the space to you, Kulsum Sahaba, to kind of moderate the discussion.
Thank you. I actually wanted to come back to both Ghazala and to Bill, but also to Sanval, because we actually have somebody in the room, even though he may have started with moderating, with a great deal of knowledge on development issues and particularly air quality, so on the ground. And actually, I wanted to start with a question for Ghazala. You said that climate risk and environmental risk could unravel the poverty reduction that's happened. This is a conference in terms of talking about development pathways. So could I ask the question the other way around? Does actually just developing as a country make you more resilient and more able to cope with climate? So over to you.
So I think the simple answer to that is yes. The global evidence is that countries that are already more developed will have a much easier time of coping with climate risk. The question facing countries like us is, can we develop the way they developed, right? Which is that in the time that they were investing in these things, they could mitigate, they could like do as much carbon, use fossil fuel energy, they did a lot of things. It's put the whole globe at risk, but they are much more resilient, right? For us, the pathway, and fortunately there is a pathway, to do the same, and to really, most of the report is really a focus on development. Our focus should be development. It's how we do development, right? It's just literally about the how now, right? And so there are pathways through which we can do development that actually are what we call win-win-win, right? Which is they do development, they build resilience, and most of them also mitigate, right? And if human capital doesn't, that's fine, right? We have to decarbonize energy to make that possible, but we have to bring people out of poverty and allow them to consume more energy.
Okay, great. So let me focus on it then from a development perspective and come to you, Sanval, and to Bill. Let's take the stunting number that you put up there. You said it was 38%. We were the highest in the region, and that child mortality was double. Actually, the global burden of disease is some work that the WHO do. They actually put all the diseases and deaths and look at it in a way that you can actually compare all of them together. And I was just struck by the comment by the deputy governor of the state bank yesterday when he was talking about macro stability and talking about Pakistan being compared with Angola. Because when you actually look at health burden, the global burden of disease, and report, and you see where Pakistan comes, Pakistan is compared with Haiti in terms of the types of illnesses and the productivity. In that report, this is done every 10 years. It was last done in 2019, so this is 2019 data. The biggest risk there is malnutrition. The highest risk, the second highest is air pollution. And I just actually wanted to turn to Sanval to give us a sense of what are the kinds of impacts we're talking about in terms of air pollution in Pakistan.
Thank you, Kulsum Sahiba. So I'll draw on the report that you and I did recently for the IGC and CDPR. For the longest time, I think both social scientists, especially economists, have kind of focused on the larger health impacts. So direct impacts such as cardiovascular diseases, evidence of an increase in heart diseases because of exposure to particulate matter, et cetera. But now there's this overwhelming kind of focus on these indirect impacts. So there's this great NBR working paper by Graf Zibin and co-authors, just kind of looking at summarizing the literature around sort of these larger cognitive impacts of exposure. And so what they're showing is that it's not just sort of, an increase in, so taking the conversation away from these larger health impacts, but kind of showing that there's brain stunting involved, there's severe cognitive dysfunction, exposure to PM 2.5 in schools leads to poor grades. Students don't perform well on standardized tests. There's this another NBR working paper is demonstrating that exposure to particulate matter increases the risk of suicide. And then the channel for that is depression and mental well-being. So all these larger non-health or direct health impacts that really kind of have increased the information set that we have on what the cost of exposure to air pollution is. The other fascinating thing about sort of which kind of people overlook is we often focus on outdoor air pollution, but indoor air pollution is equally important. And there we see a lot of these heterogeneous impacts because it's often women and children who are exposed to indoor air pollution because on average it's women who are like sort of spend more time in the kitchen, and then so they have young kids with them, and so there's this and the kind of exposure that you get to indoor air pollution is exorbitant compared to we think about outdoor air pollution as being super high, but the sort of direct impact or the exposure that you get to indoor particulate matter tends to be on orders of magnitude higher. So that the sort of social cost of that exposure tends to be quite skewed, and so these interesting we see these interesting heterogeneous impacts when it comes to the indoor dimension. So I'm going to sort of quickly summarize the experimental evidence on what we're seeing in terms of how do we the adaptation that we're witnessing, so the sort of endogenous adaptation to these effects. So we ran this field experiment in Lahore where we provided residents and citizens with, or urban residents of Lahore with air pollution forecasts. And they were getting these on through SMS every day at 8 p.m. Plus, they got a random subsample, got a training in becoming better air pollution forecasters. And this we drew on this work by Philip Tetlock on super forecasting, but we really kind of watered it down for like a developing country urban population. And just this slight tweak in increasing human capital and providing information, what we're seeing is that our results show that leads to drastic kind of increases in welfare effects. So people are able to forecast air pollution better. As a result, they're spending, their time use changes, they're spending less time indoors, so they're readjusting the time use as a result. Their willingness to pay for for particular filtering masks goes up. But up to 5% of the price of the retail, 5% of the retail price of the mask. Plus, there is over 100 rupees per, on average, increase in willingness to pay for air pollution information. So just these small interventions, in many ways, lead to these pretty large welfare effects. So you can just focus on very low-cost interventions in terms of increasing value here.
Mm-hmm. Ghazala, what about how do you see this linking in terms of the climate priorities with respect to mitigation?
Yeah, so the reason we ran in every macro model, in every policy that we do, we included pollution impacts for that reason, because the health impacts, the productivity impacts of air pollution are so huge. And the research just keeps getting, I think, better on this, right? Yeah. I was telling you guys about the work with that they're doing with the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, where they actually find huge differences in pre- and post-operative outcomes of children who are more exposed to air pollution, and they're actually targeting through mobile air sensors that the children carry on them. I mean, so these things have very large effects. I think we've sort of just kind of been like, we're getting better information and we take it very, very seriously. So for me, the one-line issue is the only reason I would address emissions today in Pakistan is to get the air pollution and the other sort of issues down that really are environmental damage issues and not to reduce emissions.
We're going to we're just going to finish up and then have a round of questions. I wanted to then turn to the rural areas, because there's potentially a story of catalyzing growth in these, particularly the poor rural areas. We've heard about some very basic interventions in earlier sessions, such as the land cadastre, electronic land cadastre making a difference, or Dr. Barki talked about just how wheat yields are affected in terms of climate. So again, you're seeing this climate and local effects intersect. What can we do to drive greater growth in the rural areas? And again, linking that with climate.
No, that's sort of the central part of the report. I didn't spend as much time on it today because we talked a lot about it yesterday, and I didn't want us to repeat what we talked about. Hopefully, most of the same audience was here.
But give us some sound bites,
we
because
recommend
we will have a new
essentially.
audience.
We recommend essentially a clear switch away from conventional agriculture. It's not doing anything, and it's very low productivity, as we know. It's not even delivering on the productivity. So it's not like it's delivering for us and we're sacrificing something. Just move away from it, shift to regenerative, climate-smart, sustainable agriculture. You drive productivity growth. You could increase your exports, because we can't export any of Pakistan's produce. We're not okay in export markets. Either we have aflatoxins, or we have arsenic, or we have some problem with our produce. And increasingly, as the global demand changes towards more nutritious food, which is changing very fast, Pakistan is losing the kinds of markets it could have for it. India is really capitalizing on this. If you live outside, you buy all your organic and whatever pulses, grains, rice, basmati rice, everything is coming from India, right? Pakistan could be part of that, but we are not. So I think that's a no-brainer, right? You need the foundation, in a way, of the change has to be the agri-food system transformation.
Okay, thank you. Next, I want to just turn to financing all of this. And I think Bill, in that sense, is crucial. But first, I want to go back to, we had the Punjab finance minister here for the session on analytical underpinnings for sustainable development, fiscal underpinnings for sustainable development. And in the presentations that we had that in that particular session, what came out strongly was the need, was actually the word accountability. No matter what one did in terms of taxation reforms, the actual level of revenue collected was basically stable, even whether you put the rate up or down. So given that, the work that at the Shah Ahmed, Mazhar Rasim, and of course Dr. Ali Chima have done shows the importance of collecting taxation at the local level where these services are being delivered, be it to spur rural growth or be it to tackle air quality. So in that context, I'd love to hear first from you, Ghazala, then from Bill, because Bill talked about how essentially the climate finance availability is scarce, and these days in a recession pretty much worldwide, or heading towards there, it's pretty scarce. But what are the opportunities? What do we need to do here? And then what are the opportunities, Bill, for municipalities and the private sector in order to access climate finance? Let's start with Ghazala first, then Bill. Over to you.
So I think that we are all seeing globally that the availability of climate finance is way below promise, what has been promised, right? So the Paris Agreement promised 100 billion a year. 7 years later, even 100 billion total have not been dispersed on that. It doesn't look like there's a lot of financing available. That is clearly not right. I don't think we need to mince words about that. On top of that, there's this enormous emerging risk, climate risk for countries like Pakistan and others. There's no money available for that. That's not fair either. However, I think this is the world we live in now, right? We face risks that no one else is going to come and rescue us from. So I guess our approach is get yourself ready to do the things that you can do, and get yourself ready to have systems that will attract what global finance is going to come. It's not going to solve all of the problems, but it could solve some. And as I said, we're now talking about debt for nature swaps, debt for climate swaps. That's on the table. Pakistan is extremely eligible for that stuff. But it needs to demonstrate some seriousness, right? Pakistan is not seen as a country that is serious about any reform efforts, not serious about doing what it can do, whether it's for domestic taxation, whether it's for like dealing with energy efficiency or energy losses. Nothing seems to be happening here that would encourage or give confidence to finance to come in, so we can fix that, right? And there are two types of signaling for that. One is the policy reforms that we need, the removal of these subsidies and so forth. And I think that I just want to say one thing, that there's a good bit of there's very good literature showing that people oppose subsidy removal for terrible reasons. There's very good literature on this, right? They oppose that. Even people who stand to benefit from them sometimes oppose them, just because they don't understand, right? So the conversation, before you start removing subsidies or giving, then you have to have a proper conversation on what is it, who is benefiting, what does it mean for you, how will a particular class or group of people be affected. You have to build momentum for this. But nonetheless, if it's done, you build a certain confidence, I think, in the fact that Pakistan is serious. And we live in a harsh world, right? Money is not easily available, so we need to demonstrate that confidence to get money to flow. And then I think it will be available. Some of it will be
presumably
available.
domestic finance mobilization.
Yeah, that's
as well.
critical, and that's what I showed in the last graph, right? It's all about domestic finance mobilization, really. And then you have a residual gap, and then you go out and say, all right, we need money for this.
Okay. Bill, let's turn to you, because perhaps you could speak a little bit about particularly what's been happening in terms of municipalities accessing green bonds, or companies, firms, private firms accessing climate finance. Could you speak a little bit to that, please? Bill?
Yeah, sorry.
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, I would like to maybe redirect it in terms of major messages. I would say there's sort of bad news and good news here. The bad news is that, I mean, I think concessional climate finance is going to remain relatively scarce, right? The good news is that one of the big expenditure items, renewable energy, can be financed. It's competitive with fossil fueled electricity in terms of cost per kilowatt hours. It can be financed based on market financed instruments. So, I mean, I think two things here. Pakistan needs to get its self in order to be able to attract market-based financing for renewable, including issues pertaining to cost recovery, legal regulatory framework, macroeconomic stability, and rule of law. The other thing I think from the bad news, good news is that the government's bid for concessional finance should, leaving aside market-financed renewable energy, the pitch for concessional finance should focus on things like climate adaptation, agriculture, commissioning coal, worker safety nets, things that really are likely non-remunerative.
Okay, thank you. With that, let me actually open it up to some questions in the audience.
I am Ajaz, a mechanical engineer from Nust University. My question is from Bill. Pakistan has 6th largest coal reserve in the world, 175 billion tons. We have just started producing power from coal by employing clean coal technology. World has consumed their reserves, we have just started. Our share of emission is negligible in the world emission. And our emissions from those third coal power project is also below the international limits. Why you are after Pakistan to close or decommission the third plants? We have serious energy issues. We can make 1,000 megawatt for 200 years from third coal. And we can make gas out of that coal, and we can make diesel through underground coal gasification. Your comments, please.
Let's take 2 or 3, if there's more.
That's a good question.
Okay.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Ghazala, because she works in World Bank, and you guys really work closely with the governments here. So now that we have lots of evidence on, let's say, how does pollution affect our health, cognitive abilities, and how do the sugary food affects our health? And you mentioned 1/3 of Pakistan under diabetes now. What I really want to understand is this, that yours and IMF's main emphasis on the macro parts, which is the subsidies, eliminations, and things like those. I just want to learn from you that, let's say if you work with the government and say, you know what, we are linking the loans or the aid to you with this condition that you're gonna, require all the motor vehicles to do the yearly maintenance checkup. So one way you can raise revenue, other way you can reduce pollution. And second is that you double your GST on sugary drinks or foods, which is like the products that are more than 1% of sugar maybe can, with whatever, we can perhaps think about what kind of taxation can be done. And or maybe another broader question is that what really prevents you to give aid directly to the recipients in some ways, rather than channel it to governments. And you already know that there are a lot of slippages, and that happen all the time. I'm not saying all the programs can work it that way, but maybe some can. Thank you.
Okay, let's turn to Ghazala and Bill, and then we'll come back to the audience.
I just wanted to respond to this question. That's a very genuine question, honestly. I think any Pakistani could ask that question, given the kind of energy crisis we have. The evidence seems to suggest that we are at a point, there are two reasons why you shouldn't invest in new coal. One of them is that renewable energy has become a lot cheaper. And we have passed the tipping point on that, on cost. It's more cost effective. So you want to get there now. The other is that there is climate risk and there is something else called transition risk, right? And transition risk has to do with the fact that as the rest of the world moves away from something, if you keep doing that, right, then your products and you are not able. So you think about the carbon border tax adjustment that EU is already putting in place, right? Now you'll have a problem exporting to the EU, right? And so forth. So we want to take all of these risks into account. We want to take the transition risk into account. When will that transition risk be? The problem with things like investing in new coal is that they become stranded, what we call stranded assets, right? You've invested in them, now for the next 30, 40 years, you have to deal with the fact that you made this huge investment, it's going to cost you, right? So it's just smarter right now to start to think now about moving to things that are becoming cheaper to do, that are clean, and of course, we just talked about the enormous environmental impacts of coal, right? Even what's so-called clean coal and all of that. So I think those, to my mind, are the two reasons why we should do this. And I think what was the other question? It was on, yeah. So taxes. That would, we can't lend to individuals. We can only buy our own rules. We lend to governments. This is sovereign debt. And so that's one issue. But certainly, I think these things that you're talking about, specific conditions on loans, this is something we do through things like our DPOs, where we put prior conditions. And certainly those prior conditions can become far more climate sensitive, right? And that's something we are thinking about, right? Now, when we do budgetary support or development policy lending of any type, and we put these prior actions, that these prior actions should be taking care of these issues. And I think things will go there. Hope, that's our expectation, and they should. And these are things we can do, right? Things like cleaner air standards. This is not. Countries have done it, even while using fossil fuels, right? They've cleaned up their air in their cities. This is not. Many countries. Yeah, many. Yeah.
But maybe for political reasons you're not doing it. So you can kind of.
Maybe we want to.
Somewhere where it may work really.
Yeah. Actually, far better that one drives it from within, right? Rather than have someone push from the outside.
Exactly.
Bill, do you want to comment on why you talked about Thar coal? As the gentleman asked a question, why are you looking at Thar coal and decommissioning coal power plants, etc.? Do you want to explain where that comes from the government's own NDC? Just to clarify.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this comment about this characterization of clean coal technology, I mean, I just think that's a myth. I mean, it's just the dirtiest possible source of electricity you can have. I mean, if you look at worldwide emissions, it's true that Pakistan is a relatively small percentage of that. And emissions from coal electricity is an even smaller percentage of that. If you look at it on a local basis, I mean, Pakistan has a lot of air pollution. Air pollution average annual level in Lahore is 10 times the World Health Organization recommended level. So it seems like it would behoove Pakistan to be exiting from coal, especially when it has so much solar potential as well as hydro and wind. There are mechanisms for exiting it. In terms of the question of developing local coal mines, I can't see why that would be a particularly good idea. I think having huge employment in coal mining makes it very, very difficult to in terms of political economy to exit from this very, very dirty energy source, whether it's in China or India or my nearby state of West Virginia.
Okay, let's have another round of questions, please. Let's take this. Firstly, the lady back there, then this lady, then we'll come back to the two gentlemen.
Thank you for that. It's a really fascinating session. We're going to go into a whole set of sessions tomorrow on politics and political economy, so I might as well start the transition now. And I'm Shandana Khan Mamand. I'm at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. And this is so good to know what we need to do. But since yesterday, we've been, and clearly the time to act is now. And yet we've identified repeatedly how we may not be able to act now. So I'm just wondering about how do we square that circle, because we're running out of time, and yet we're talking about the fact that the basic set of incentives are not present, or the fact that we're stuck in a political economy problem in which we're not able to create those incentives. So I'm just wondering about, we have the solutions, but is there some sense of how we might be able to get that narrative going or move in that direction?
Yeah, let's the lady in the yellow sweater, then.
Hello. So my question is for Dr. Ghazala. So one of the recommendations that you mentioned was to do away with, basically get rid of all the agriculture practices because they're not benefiting us, they don't work. I understand that. What I'm trying to understand is that farmers in Pakistan, agriculture is such a huge sector. These are actual people. It's their real livelihood. So how do you account for this, just doing away, actually changing their mindsets about how do you just do it with whatever you've known basically your whole life?
And then this gentleman here.
First of all, I would like to make a comment on the comparison of coal and renewable. We know that coal right now is the cheapest way to produce energy, but when we take into account the health problems and the health issues in the nearby area and the money we have to spend or the productivity lost due to those health problems, we may know that renewable is cheaper and the coal energy is much expensive. I would like to ask you that what should the speakers say that if we impose carbon tax? I believe that carbon tax can have a very huge impact on climate change. So that's it.
Can I just add to his the tax question, because I actually wanted to ask you about that. So the tax is good enough, but the challenge seems to be, especially for like small scale industries, that how do you, is it a presumptive tax? Because the measurement issue, like if you're going to be sort of charging it on their like sort of emissions, how do you, so in agriculture, you've managed to develop those tools, but on industry, that's still a challenge, right? Like, how do you really get a good sense? And that's always something that they can challenge in courts, etc. How much
so I can. Should I start with that one? Let's start with the last one, maybe.
Let's get the last question.
Oh, okay.
Because because
okay, just want to remember
then
them
I can
all,
give
so
you
please remember the
some
questions
time
because
and build some time.
Thank you. My name is Irtaza Rana. I'm a practicing farmer, and I serve on a board of an environmental NGO, Green Circle organization. I've done extensive work on air quality, and it's just to point something out. If you just look at your AQI right now, the AQI at the Lums Gate, which is hardly a few meters away, is 160, and when you walk here, it jumps over to 209. I don't know what magical things happen to increase the air, pollution within this building, and then so there's definitely something wrong with the sensors they're working with. But I'm sorry.
Students smoking in the corners or something.
Probably, that could be it. So my first question to you, Madam Ghazala, would be that, you mentioned a very good policy presentation that you have. So your policies will give us a roadmap which will then, give us a way forward. But what kind of roadblocks that come into, into the policies road map do you account for? Because as a practicing farmer, I can tell you, you mentioned, removing the subsidies. So talking about the farmers in Kasur who are being, I think 2018 was the last time they had an audit of the electricity meters that they had, and that they showed that they were being overbilled. So a farmer who's already being overbilled through a faulty meter, and not just one farmer, the entire the district. And when you tell him that okay, regardless of that, over faulty metering, we're going to remove the subsidy, and then after removal of that subsidy, you're going to have an even higher electricity bill. Obviously, he's going to come to your roads, and he's going to. So those kind of roadblocks are there. And how do you account for that in your policy and in your roadmap? And then another question would be for the climate financing. CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, we all aware it's been around for a very long time, and you have that for energy sector. For the agriculture sector, what we're trying to do is we're working with farmers, and we're trying to give them a carbon avoidance methodology, whereby they can sort of avoid the carbon emissions, because we've calculated what kind of emissions they come from the rice stock burning. And we're having a very increasingly and tremendously hard time trying to figure out how to go about getting financing for those kind of projects, and then how to trade our carbon credits that we get, because clearly the government does not have a roadmap for that. There's no mechanism for that. So these kind of roadblocks, how do they fit into your policy, and what kind of things are you doing to address these issues?
Okay, over to, we have one more? No? That's it. Over to you, Ghazala and Bill. You want to start?
I do not want things to lurk in confusion. I just want one clear, because you answered that you do not really give loans to people directly.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. But I am saying in a sense that, look, let's think a little bit out of the box solution. Let's say you give funding.
Can we just
Yeah,
let her?
later
Because
perhaps.
this is not, sorry.
Okay.
I think
This
we
might
have
be a
to,
little
because this is
distracting.
kind of going off the topic. This
Yes,
has nothing to
it's
do
going
with
off the topic.
topic
you.
of climate change, how the bank finances. Over to Ghazala.
I would just want to start with your questions.
Shandana,
Let's go
yes.
right away to Shandana's
Political
question.
economy, yeah.
And I've been struggling with this myself. I don't have the answer. I mean, yesterday at some level was very interesting, at another level even more depressing, and Pakistan, thinking about Pakistan, working on Pakistan is a very depressing business, right? Let's just be honest about it, it's very depressing, right? It's just, if you allow yourself to get depressed, you can spend a lot of time being depressed because nothing moves, nothing happens, right? It's very frustrating. So, I mean, I think the idea of putting good evidence together, that's sort of, I ask myself the following question: so what can I do? And I say, all right, what I can do, given my skill set, is I can produce better evidence, and then I can engage with that evidence with other people in a way that's accessible, interesting, useful, have a conversation, and we keep moving the track. What else can we do? I mean, like, we can do what we can do, right? And so I guess, but it's really, I don't have any answers to that, none. Yeah, we're all in the same boat on that one. So on agri, I think there were two questions sort of related. Yeah. I'm by no means suggesting that we tell farmers tomorrow, all right, zip, we're moving. When we say that there's going to be an agri-food system transformation, we're only saying that it needs to happen. How, at what speed, how you take people along, how you change the extension system, give them better information. You have to sort of do soil science. All of this has to be done, right? So it's a gradual shift, and farmers will have to be supported. And I made that point yesterday, so I didn't have enough time to make it today. We have to support farmers through the transition, yeah? I don't know what other question I did not, carbon tax? And I think your carbon tax question, if I understood correctly, was it's not a tax on looking at emissions. We're not there yet. We don't have those systems. It's a simple tax that's really on use. Yeah.
Let's turn to Bill if he has anything to say on agriculture. There's the CDM in energy, but on agriculture, I just wondered if are you aware of what the climate finance options are on agriculture?
I think on agriculture, that would be probably a better candidate for concessional financing, right? We had some in the paper discussion on rice stubble burning and the possibility of using this technology, the happy seeder or something, which at $4,000 a machine, it would cost $100 or $150 million for to equip farmers in Punjab and Sindh with these things. Conceivably, some sort of a if usage could be verified, some sort of a debt for nature swap might be done there conceivably. But a more straightforward approach might be just getting concessional financing. I just think that would be easier for such an agriculturally related project. On that earlier question, I was happy to see in Ghazala's presentation that carbon taxes are slated, I believe, to go up to $40 per ton. I think that's, within the range, at the lower end of the range, $40 to $80 per ton that various luminaries thought is what's needed these days. The faster Pakistan could get to $40 per ton, the better, I think.
Let Ijaz also, because he's got something to add to this, since you were co-authors on this work.
Right. So let me just say a few words on crop burning. Given you can come at it from the mitigation angle, or you can come at it from the adaptation angle.
Absolutely.
Because crop burning has real bad effects, which is air pollution, health costs.
Yeah.
And therefore, World Bank or Asian Development Bank, these sources of concessionary finance, can very easily justify the cost of $150 or $200 million that it will cost to change the technology in agriculture, happy seeder or improvements on happy seeder, in order to avoid the health costs, which is why it is such a good candidate for concessionary finance.
Agreed.
Right.
Anything further? I just want to respond just to that, please. Because that's exactly, so you need a lot of mulch for regenerative agriculture, for sustainable agriculture. These crop residues are invaluable, right? And we burn them, so we're wasting them, and we're heating up soil in the process as we burn them. And so there's this is something that's simply so easy. Right? And farmers on the other side have already started adopting that in Punjab. They're using happy seed. We've done some work. In fact, in the report, we have a pilot that we talk about where this was done. You mulch, basically use the crop residues to mulch and use the precision planter. Save seed also. Huge saving on seed.
In fact, one of the consequences of COP27 is that the multilateral development banks are now being examined microscopically their capacity to provide concessionary finance.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Absolutely. I think this is a good note to end on. Shandana is gone, but actually I just want to literally in a few words, even though it's been a very rich conversation, firstly thank Ghazala and thank Bill for joining us from Washington, D.C. with such a huge time difference. Yes, absolutely. Woke up at 4 in the morning. So thank you, Bill.
That's very punitive.
And thank you, Ghazala, for a super presentation. Essentially, what we're hearing. So let me. I want to have these 3 sentences. I think what we're hearing is the importance of development, literally, for Pakistan. We're also hearing that development, can be made more resilient. But we're also hearing that concessional finance in a big way actually is not there. What is there is if, as a country, we decide we're moving forward on a bunch of stuff and have some domestic mobilization of funds, and then use that to actually leverage and get these additional funds to make it much more climate resilient, our development. And then, again, going back to another word, I'd say going back to Shandana's point is, the political economy is tough, but the word that has, at least for me, come up in every single session has been accountability. or the lack thereof. There are actually tons of solutions. Everybody has them, but there's the accountability as to who would do what. That is the one that seems to be kind of up there in the air. And the only solution I've heard thus far on the accountability is to move the fiscal underpinnings, where you raise the money
I agree
closer
with you. Not
to where
everyone does.
closer to where the benefits are. So, and we are talking about the rural areas. We heard the Punjab finance minister talk about agricultural taxes. We heard about urban property taxes. These are ways to actually get domestic mobilization quite easily and quickly, and then to use that to leverage actually the concessional money that is out there to make our development more resilient. So I'll leave you with that thought, and look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow, because tomorrow we get to the political economy, the third leg of this development, accountability, fiscal underpinnings framework. Thank you.